Ernest Hemingway once famously wrote that bankruptcy happens in two ways: gradually, then suddenly. What we have witnessed coming out of Washington in the last 6 hours is that suddenly moment. This is no longer a standard trade war involving disputed tariffs. This is an all-out financial assault that the United States has historically reserved only for its worst enemies, regimes we seek to topple, nations we intend to starve into submission. And as of 3:17 this morning, that weapon is now pointed directly at Canada. The U.S. Treasury Department has just issued an emergency directive to every major American financial institution, from J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs to Wells Fargo, ordering them to terminate all correspondent banking relationships with Canadian financial institutions within 72 hours. If you don't work in finance, let me explain this in plain English. The correspondent banking system is the plumbing of global finance. Almost every international transaction, whether a Canadian company paying a supplier in Europe or a citizen swiping a credit card while on vacation, must flow through U.S. banks to clear in dollars. By cutting off this system, you aren't just restricting trade, you are severing a nation from the modern economy, turning their currency into monopoly money, and making it impossible for their businesses to operate internationally. This is the financial nuclear weapon, an extreme measure that has only ever been used 3 times in history: against Iran in 2012, North Korea in 2017, and Russia in 2022. 3 countries treated as international pariahs. And now, Donald Trump has added Canada, the country that stormed Juno Beach beside American soldiers, the country that opened its airports to thousands of stranded Americans on 9/11, to that exact same list. The crux of tonight lies in the fact that Trump has pulled a weapon you are never supposed to use against your closest ally. As the world reels in shock, I am going to show you exactly what Mark Carney did to make Trump so desperate that he hit the destruction button, and why the next 72 hours will determine whether the global economy survives or falls apart completely under the weight of an unrestrained ego. To understand why Washington triggered the financial nuclear weapon early this morning, we have to turn back the clock to yesterday evening, behind the closed doors of the White House. This is where traditional diplomacy died, giving way to the most intense personal confrontation between 2 completely opposite operating systems. Donald Trump, with the instincts of a fighter, issued an ultimatum he believed was impossible to refuse. Through a private intermediary, the White House sent an offer to Ottawa. The president was willing to discuss de-escalating tariffs if Canada publicly declared that this entire dispute was merely a technical misunderstanding. Read that carefully. Trump wasn't asking for economic concessions. He was demanding a surrender of honor. He wanted Mark Carney to stand at a podium and tell the world that the freezing of sovereign assets, the threats of border militarization, and the economic strangulation of a G7 partner were just a minor mix-up between friends. Trump wanted Carney to humiliate himself to save the face of the presidency. And Ottawa's response? It didn't come after days of negotiation. It came in exactly 11 minutes. In the world of diplomacy, 11 minutes isn't time for drafting. It's time for a stinging slap across the face. The response was just one sentence: Canada does not negotiate under coercion. We will see the president at the appropriate international forum. According to 3 separate reports from inside the White House that we have obtained, when Donald Trump read this, he didn't scream. He became eerily quiet, the kind of quiet those who work for him have learned to fear, and uttered exactly 5 words. Cut them off from everything. There was no policy discussion, no consultation with trade lawyers or Treasury economists. Those 5 words, born from the bruised ego of one man at 2:30 in the afternoon, activated the entire American financial warfare machinery against 40 million Canadians just 12 hours later. This rupture is no longer about fentanyl, nor is it about trade deficits. It has become a war between a governance style of fear and the steadfastness of a technocrat who does not flinch. Mark Carney wagered that the global financial system is too complex to be manipulated by one man's rage, but Donald Trump just proved he is willing to burn down the plumbing of the global economy just to retaliate for an 11-minute reply. Tonight, the leaks from senior Treasury officials themselves, who called this directive reckless and suicidal, are the clearest warning that the fire from the White House is starting to incinerate the very credibility of the U.S. dollar. While Washington was still gloating over the nuclear weapon it had just detonated, across the border, the man in the dark suit was already 2 steps ahead. At 4 o'clock this morning Eastern Time, Mark Carney did something no Canadian leader has ever done. He convened an emergency session of Parliament in the middle of the night. This wasn't a standard cabinet meeting. It was only the 4th emergency session in Canadian history, placing the gravity of this event on par with September 11. Carney stood before members of Parliament, many still in sweatshirts under their coats, and took exactly 12 minutes to announce a plan that, if successful, would forever end the monopoly of the U.S. dollar in North American economic exchange. The first and boldest measure is the Canadian Financial Sovereignty Act. Carney didn't beg the U.S. to reopen the plumbing. He announced the construction of a new set of pipes. This act authorizes the Bank of Canada to establish direct currency settlement agreements with any willing central bank, bypassing the U.S. dollar entirely. This means Canada will buy from Europe in euros, sell energy to Japan in yen, and trade with the UK in pounds. Once this infrastructure exists, it never goes away, and the U.S. dollar shifts from a necessity to an option. But Carney didn't stop there. The second measure is a direct hit to the liquidity of U.S. banks, the Strategic Asset Repatriation Directive. Carney ordered the immediate withdrawal of nearly $380 billion in Canadian government assets held in U.S. financial institutions. This isn't a months-long process. He demanded it happen in days. Imagine hundreds of billions of dollars pulled out of New York all at once. It is a liquidity shock that could trigger a domino effect across an already rattling U.S. banking system. Finally, the deadliest blow was the pre-dawn call to the governor of the People's Bank of China. Carney doesn't need to sign a military alliance with Beijing to cause panic in Washington. He only needs to reveal that Canada is considering alternative financial solutions from the East. This is a masterstroke of geopolitics. Carney is telling the hawks at the Pentagon that if Trump continues to strangle Canada, he will push America's closest ally into the arms of its greatest rival. Mark Carney isn't negotiating with emotion. He is negotiating by turning America's dependence on systemic stability into its fatal weakness. All the countermoves from Ottawa we discussed in the previous section have immediately rebounded onto New York, turning Wall Street into a financial war zone early this morning. Understand this. The correspondent banking system isn't just how Canada accesses the dollar. It's how U.S. banks make money. Every transaction flowing through this system generates fees and liquidity. When Donald Trump ordered the cutoff of Canada, he wasn't just attacking Ottawa. He was directly picking the pockets of his own banks. Evidence number 1 is the collapse of the banking sector's stocks. In pre-market trading alone, J.P. Morgan shares dropped 7%, Goldman Sachs fell 8%, and Citigroup plunged 9%. But the most staggering was Bank of America with an 11% drop in a single morning. Why? Because analysts at Morgan Stanley estimate that if this directive is fully implemented, the U.S. banking sector will lose approximately $14 billion in annual revenue immediately. This is no longer politics. This is a financial hemorrhage caused by the president himself. And Wall Street CEOs are calling this an act of systematic sabotage. Evidence number 2 is the shattering of trust in the dollar's neutrality. The international financial system operates on a single belief. The dollar is a professional, apolitical tool. But this morning, that belief died. When a senior Treasury official leaked that this directive was reckless and suicidal, the world received a message. Any nation, even the closest ally, can be financially unplugged simply because of one individual's ego. As a result, a noisy exodus from the dollar has begun. The European Central Bank convened an emergency meeting to discuss creating a euro-based settlement system entirely independent of U.S. jurisdiction. They aren't doing this to be confrontational. They are doing it because their fiduciary duty to clients requires a plan B when Washington becomes unpredictable. Mark Carney saw through this play. He knew that if Canada stands firm for 72 hours, the pressure from the collapse of dollar confidence would force Wall Street to turn its guns back toward the White House. Tonight, as gold hits record highs and Bitcoin jumps 11% in 2 hours, the world is voting against Trump's chaos by seeking any haven that isn't named the U.S. dollar. We have seen the collapse on the stock market, but the real shockwaves are occurring right now on Capitol Hill, where the wall of loyalty that has long surrounded Donald Trump is beginning to show irreparable cracks. Understand this. For years, the Republican Party has stood by Trump through every crisis, from impeachments to indictments. But this morning, the final line was crossed. That line is national prosperity. Immediately after the correspondent banking ban was announced, 3 Republican senators who are not Trump's enemies, but powerful members representing states with vital economic ties to Canada, publicly rose in protest. One of them issued a statement that I believe will go down in history. This directive is unconstitutional, unhinged, and un-American. I did not come to Washington to watch a president destroy our most important alliance over a personal grudge. This is a historic turning point. Why? Because this time, it is not a war over culture or ideology. It is a war over money and corporate survival. When senators began receiving urgent calls from CEOs, the very people who fund their campaigns about frozen supply chains and threatened assets, political loyalty was forced to give way to economic reality. This fracture signals that Trump's nuclear weapon has backfired right at home. Mark Carney wagered that the U.S. political system would self-correct in the face of disaster, and he was right. Tonight, as congressional leaders begin discussing legislative measures to revoke the president's emergency financial powers, we are witnessing an unprecedented realignment of power. Donald Trump has found the line that even his own party will not let him cross, and the next 66 hours will be the harshest test of his control over the very machine he leads. Of all the scenarios the White House could have imagined when they detonated the financial nuclear weapon this morning, perhaps none was worse than seeing their closest ally pick up the phone to call America's greatest rival. At 5 a.m., Mark Carney performed a geopolitical maneuver so bold it shook the halls of the Pentagon. He publicly confirmed a direct negotiation with the governor of the People's Bank of China. Understand the tactic here. Carney has no desire to turn Canada into a Beijing ally. He is far too sophisticated for that trap, but he knows exactly what Washington fears most: losing strategic allies to Chinese influence. By making this call public, Carney is sending a wordless message to the hawks in the U.S. If you kick us out of the dollar system, we will find another system to survive. It is a sophisticated move designed to force Trump's own national security supporters to turn back and pressure the president to de-escalate, because the price of punishing Canada is the total collapse of the decade-long U.S. strategy to contain China. The tremors immediately reached Capitol Hill, where the wall of loyalty surrounding Trump has begun to crumble. 3 powerful Republican senators representing states with vital economic ties to Canada, stood before cameras to publicly denounce the directive as unconstitutional and unhinged. One of them exclaimed, "I did not come here to watch a president destroy our most important alliance over a personal grudge." Unlike past controversies such as impeachment or legal indictments, this risk is not about culture or ideology. This risk is about money. When the CEOs of massive corporations and major donors see their businesses being decimated by an impulsive decree, loyalty to Trump starts to evaporate. Donald Trump has finally found a line that even his own party will not let him cross: the line of American prosperity. Mark Carney wagered that the pocketbook would always defeat the ego, and the next 66 hours will be the ultimate test of whether America can wake up before its own financial system is incinerated by the fire from the White House. All the cards are on the table. We are standing at the 66-hour mark before the North American economy enters a gray zone unprecedented in history. But folks, make no mistake, this isn't just a countdown for Canada. This is a countdown for the status of the U.S. Dollar as the world's anchor, Mark Carney, with the mindset of a systemic risk manager, has turned Trump's 72-hour threat into a golden opportunity to prove a post-American scenario to the world. By going public with calls to Beijing and accelerating payment systems with the Eurozone, Carney has indirectly sent a reverse ultimatum to Washington. If you use the dollar as a blade, we will turn it into a relic. Evidence of this pivot is the instantaneous shift in sovereign trust. Right now, it's not just Canada pulling funds. Central banks in Asia and the Middle East are watching the U.S. Treasury directive with absolute horror. They realize that if this can happen to a G7 ally, no one is safe. As a result, we are seeing the scenario of forced de-dollarization play out faster than ever. Carney has triggered a chain reaction where Republican senators have begun to realize they cannot protect a solitary ego if the price is the collapse of the global financial system that America leads. The next 66 hours are not just a deadline to rescind a decree. They are a deadline for Washington to decide if it wants to remain the center of the world or become an isolated island while the rest of the planet learns to trade without us. Mark Carney has finished building the infrastructure for a new world in the shadows of that midnight emergency session. And now, the ball is entirely in the White House's court, where silence is the sound of power leaking through every crack in trust.